Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the March presentation in the speaker series, Toxicology and Societies, the Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Tracy Collier, a toxicologist, and I spent most of my career at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center. My co-hosts are Ruth Sofield, an environmental toxicology and chemistry professor. Hey, Ruth, at Western Washington University, and Ian Moran, who I think is not with us today, but he's an environmental toxicology visiting assistant professor. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join in expressing our deep respect and gratitude to our indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, yes, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. A few logistics to start. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use the Q&A feature to interact. You should have different viewing options in Zoom, and we suggest you use speaker view so you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and societies. Today, we're really happy to welcome Deborah Giles as our speaker. Dr. Giles is a science and research director at the nonprofit Wild Orca. She received her PhD from UC Davis in 2014, and her dissertation was focused on southern resident killer whales. Giles is also currently a resident scientist and lecturer at the University of Washington's Friday Harbor Labs, where she teaches marine mammals of the Salish Sea and marine biology. Welcome, Giles, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's all yours. I think you're on mute.
You'd think after 4 years, I'd get that. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to present on the southern resident killer whales. I'll just get going with my screen share, and I'm going to go pretty quickly here, so we have a lot of space at the end to chat. Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. And trying to go to, there we go. Okay, well, here is my contact information if you would like to jot that down. If you have any questions, I also have a slide at the end with my email and whatnot on it. And I always welcome follow-up questions if we can't get to everything today. So I'm Giles. I'm the Science and Research Director at the nonprofit Wild Orca. We took over the Whale Scout Project from the University of Washington's Dr. Sam Wasser back in 2021. I had been a part of his program, his Scout Project, since 2009. And then as he was moving more into tracking genetics of illegally harvested endangered species, we took over, my nonprofit Wild Orca took over the program. And so we're excited to have this as part of our what we do. So I love this slide. This was actually a slide that was in this PowerPoint, and it was just an example. This quote was an example of some of how this slide would look. But I really like this quote, and so I've left it in. And it's by Walt Disney, saying the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. With killer whale research and recovery, we do a lot of talking, and that is important, but we're really at the point now where we need to be taking broader, bolder actions. Excuse me. Just wanted to make mention, I had forgotten this slide was in here, and I decided to leave it in for today's presentation. Today marks, I think, not today, this year marks my, I think, 37th or 38th anniversary of seeing the whales for the first time. I love this picture. This was taken at Whale Watch Park, also known as Lime Kiln, here on San Juan Island. And this is me seeing the whales the weekend of my 18th birthday. And I already knew I loved whales. I already knew I wanted to spend my life dedicated to them in some way, specifically killer whales. But this weekend that I was up here 37 years ago really changed my life. And There you go. There's me at 18 years old seeing a breaching killer whale from Limekiln. And this is a fantastic picture because it really gives you an idea of how close the whales actually do come to the west side, or at least how close they used to come when there was fish here for them to find. So our mission is translating science into action to save the southern resident killer whales from extinction. And we do this in what we call our three-pronged approach, or our three-pillar approach. The first of it is our conservation research, which I mentioned. That is the scat detection work, where we utilize the superpowers of a scent detection dog on the front of the boat to help us sniff out killer whale feces from a distance. The way that other folks have collected whale scat in the past and currently still do is by conducting what are called fluke follows, which is basically right behind the whale in their path. And that's an okay way to do it if that's the only option that you have. And sometimes we have to utilize that option as well. If the tides are not in our favor, or the wind is weird, or we've got strong currents, we'll have to do fluke follows. But generally speaking, we are up to a half or even more, half a mile away from the back end of the whales. So we have this conservation research. We are out on the water collecting the fecal samples, and then they are shipped to our partners at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. These are the folks that are responsible for the recovery of California condor, black-footed ferret, and many other species. And they're really experts in looking at hormones and toxicants. So how are toxicants in the marine realm, or in the wild, not just in the marine realm, but how are toxicants impacting different animal species' ability to reproduce? The next part of what we do is our strategic advocacy, and in this we translate science. So we take what can be hard to understand research papers and break them down into language that anybody can understand, the general public and policymakers. And then we provide actions, opportunities for people to get engaged. And I'll talk more about that at the very end. And then lastly, which is unique, not that many nonprofits engage, or not that many research groups engage in actual direct policy engagement. And what I mean by that is that we actively seek out meetings with our elected officials to make sure that these officials have the most available, best available and most recent science at their fingertips. So anytime there's a change or anything new that we're learning, we're actively seeking out meetings with our elected officials to make sure that they have what they need to make good policy decisions. And then our research is handed directly to managers tasked with recovering these whales. So that's at this county, state, and federal level, both in the US and in Canada. So who are the southern resident killer whales? We're back down to 74 after the exciting news in December with the birth of a new baby, J60. Unfortunately, he died within just probably 2 weeks of being born. This is very much in line with what our findings from analyzing fecal samples have been showing for the last since basically 2007. And we'll talk more about that as well. So this is a population of fish-eating killer whales. They only eat fish. They preferentially eat salmon, and of the 5 salmon species that occur throughout this group of whales range, they forage on 4 of those. They forego eating pink salmon, and they preferentially, out of the 4 salmon species that they do eat, they preferentially are seeking out and foraging on the largest of the species, and that's the Chinook salmon, also known as king salmon. There are 3 pods within this clan. So there's one clan called J clan, and then 3 pods within the clan: J pod, K pod, and L pod. And they all are connected by genetics. They only breed within their clan. So there's no outbreeding, or at least very little. Maybe every couple hundred years there might be a single mating. I wish there was more. With a different ecotype known as the offshore killer whales, and those guys eat fish as well as sharks. But generally speaking, this is an insular population of whales, and that they're connected again by genetics and by language and culture. So the southern residence range goes from, technically in the listing documents, their range is to southeast Alaska. They really don't go up there very much in order to avoid competition with the two other fish-eating populations that occur between here and there. So generally speaking, they tend to stay around the Haida Gwaii, which is at the island up there at the very top. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up here, Haida Gwaii, also known as Queen Charlotte Islands. And then all the way down to Monterey for K-Pod and L-Pod. J-Pod is not known to go south of Washington, the Washington border. J-Pod is generally the most resident of the resident 3 pods. The inner waters of the Salish Sea were designated as critical habitat way back in 2006, just 1 year after the whales were listed on the endangered species list. But it took until 2021 to list these, to list the outer coast critical habitat for these whales. And that's important when we're talking about activities that are that would need federal approval, because it allows the whales a little bit more protection to protect their habitat. Happy to answer questions about that if we have any at the end. These whales are incredibly interesting animals. They have culture. They absolutely are individuals. They each have different personalities, and I feel so fortunate to get to study them and get to know them and have gotten to know them over the last 20 years that I've been professionally studying them. They engage in all kinds of interesting behaviors like kelping. We don't know why they do this, but they actively seek out kelp beds and roll around in it. And this is just a picture here of J2, the oldest known killer whale ever to have lived. She died somewhere between her late 80s or even as old as her early 100, like as old as possibly 105. And she was just an incredible animal, definitely the matriarch of the whole clan. And so I show these pictures just to kind of give people a sense of who these animals are. They also engage, or I hope they continue to engage even when we're not seeing it, but we used to get to see these amazing greeting ceremonies where the different pods coming into contact with one another after a long time. J-pod, for example, might be in the inland waters already, and then say K or L-pod will come in for the first time after being gone for a few months. And the whales will rush towards each other in their pods, and then each pod lines up peck to peck, just all lined up in a row, one pod facing the other pod. And you can kind of see that in this more bluish picture down here at the bottom, where we had members of K-pod and members of L-pod that came into contact with each other after several months. And they do this and they line up and they're really quiet. They don't make any sound when they're in this formation. And then we don't really know what the social cue is, but something happens, and then you just end up having this phenomenal coming together of whales, this whale ball. And different groups of animals will head off and hang out together, like the old females will go off in one group and the young males will go off in another, and females that are pregnant will be surrounded by other females. It's just an incredible thing to get to witness. And again, we don't get to see this as regularly as we used to, because there's just not enough food in the inland waters of the Salish Sea to bring them together like this. So again, as I mentioned, I hope this happens on the outer coast where we're not getting to witness it, but it's just a phenomenal behavior. So the whales were listed on the Endangered Species List, the Canadian equivalent on the Species at Risk Act, or the SARA Act, in 2001. And then our federal government finally got around to getting them on the list in 2005. They identified many different threats to the whales, but the three that really percolated to the top in the listing was the lack of prey, specifically Chinook salmon, vessel presence and associated noise. The Salish Sea is an incredibly busy area, especially with tankers like this. These are ocean-going tankers going in and out of the Salish Sea, and this type of vessel, this vessel class, is increasing exponentially with the and it will continue to do so with the change and the expansion of the two terminals in Canada. And so what we end up saying, you know, a way to visualize this is that if you can see one of these container ships on the horizon, it's potentially loud enough to limit the whale's ability to echolocate and find food. And we're seeing, like I said, up to 4 times more of these vessels in the inland waters in the last couple of years. And then the last of the 3 main ones is the exposure to toxicants. So toxicants being man-made chemicals. So these are chemicals that are human-made, that are making their way into the food web in the marine realm, and ultimately into the apex predators, such as humans, really, and killer whales. So these threats work synergistically together, where when the whales are not getting enough to eat, they're metabolizing their fat stores, and almost 100% of the toxicants or persistent organic pollutants that are impacting these whales are what are called lipophilic toxicants. So these are chemicals that are locked up in the fat stores of these whales as long as the whales are getting to eat regularly. These whales are mammals like we are. They need to eat every day in order to maintain optimal health. They are not like other whale species that are have evolved over time to go through long periods of fasting, like gray whales and humpback whales. So if the whales, these toothed whales, are getting enough to eat every day, then the toxicants get locked up in their fat stores. Unfortunately, with the southern residents, because they're facing all of these threats and because the prey has declined so considerably, they're essentially in periods of starvation almost all the time. And so they're continuously metabolizing their fat stores and releasing those toxicants into their system, which causes immune compromised situation. It makes them more susceptible to disease and ultimately early death. So as I said, the biggest problem is the lack of prey. And it's the breakdown, the lack of prey is causing a breakdown in the social structure of this population as a whole. So as I mentioned, there's just not enough food in the inland waters of the Salish Sea to bring all 3 pods together. Sometimes there's not even enough food to bring all of J-pod, for example, together. And so we end up having a situation where they're breeding with members of their own pod, or in some very unfortunate cases with their own family. And so that this is caused an inbreeding situation that we really need to counteract with having enough food for them throughout their entire range, so that members of all 3 pods can come together and be breeding with each other and lessen that potential problem with inbreeding. Again, I do want to stress the fact that because these are small populations and have been historically over time, they are considered inbred. But the northern resident fish-eating killer whales, as well as other populations of killer whales around the world, are as inbred or even more inbred. And yet, because those populations have enough food, we're not seeing a problem with the fact that these are insular populations. So again, just another reason for us to really be honing in on the lack of prey as being the biggest problem, and the biggest problem that we need to address. I just show these photos to remind people that these whales do cooperatively hunt and share food. And so when you think about a situation where these whales are incredibly hungry themselves, they still will find one fish and share it with their family members, even though they're most assuredly quite hungry themselves. It's part of their culture to share their food. And I love this picture. It's both heartbreaking and beautiful. Here again, the whale all the way over on the right-hand photo on the right is J2 again. Granny, she was known as. This is one of the last known photos of her. This was taken at the end of 2016. And she's shown here, if you squint, you can kind of see this salmon here between these whales. This is her great grandson. And she spent a fair amount of time that day trying to push that fish towards her great grandson to teach him how to forage, because his mom had died earlier that year. And so again, these are whales that are their culture is to share food. And we just need to make sure that we're getting enough of it into the marine realm so that they're fat and happy, basically, and not circulating those toxicants in their system. Unfortunately, the situation with the stocks, the salmon stocks throughout the Wales Range, all the way down to California and up through Southeast Alaska, is not looking good. There are many, many, many runs of salmon throughout these. These are showing rivers of concern, where there are, in some cases, multiple, like for example, the Columbia River is multiple stocks through the Columbia that are on the endangered list as threatened or endangered themselves. So populations of salmon, Chinook salmon specifically, are declining throughout the Wales' entire range, which does not bode well. And this is really the problem. People have asked, how can you have this apex predator that is as big as a killer whale that only eats fish? And these photos on the right really answer that. These photos are taken in 1910. And I think in the 1920s or 30s, these are showing these photos are showing salmon that were massive. These are salmon that were over 100 pounds in some cases, almost 5 feet tall. And so for a whale that needs to eat, depending on the age and sex, and kind of what stage of life they are they a pregnant female or a lactating female or an adult male? Or a juvenile, these whales need to eat several hundreds of pounds of fish per whale per day. So before we became such efficient killing machines ourselves, these whales had access to massive fish. And so they were easily able to meet their caloric needs, their daily caloric needs. Unfortunately, we did become incredibly efficient at extracting fish, huge runs of fish from the marine realm. These men are shown knee deep or even thigh deep these are sockeye salmon, but the same thing happened for all species of salmon. And not only salmon, but this industrialized fishing also became incredibly efficient at taking out the salmon's prey. So things like herring and sardine and smelt and smaller fish that the salmon need to eat, and even more so things like krill that the smaller, what are sometimes referred to as bait fish or schooling fish. We're also now extracting the krill, so we're extracting everything at all levels of the food chain, and it's really leading to kind of cascading impacts to the marine ecosystem. So this is a photo that is showing coast-wide abundance of Chinook salmon. And in a nutshell, when we don't have enough fish in the marine realm throughout the whale's entire range, we end up seeing large numbers of deaths that year. So this purple bar chart at the top is a negative bar chart. So the longer the bar, the more deaths that year. And it's very tightly correlated with low salmon abundance equals high death. Happy to talk more about that too, but I'm looking at the clock and need to get on to telling you about what we do. So at Wild Orca, to understand what's happening on the inside of the whale, we look at what's coming out the back end of the whale. And as I mentioned, we do this utilizing a scent detection dog on the front of our boat. This is Eba. Eba is our current whale scat dog. She learned her craft in 2019, and then has been our scat dog ever since then. And she's phenomenal at her job. She is a rescue dog. All of our dogs that we've ever had on this project are rescue dogs. They're not purebred dogs. They're either found on the street like Eba was, or they are rescued from the animal shelter. We're looking for dogs with high play drive. We don't reward our dogs with food because we don't want to keep our dogs a little bit hungry in order for them to do their job. We're looking for dogs that just want to play. And ideally dogs that don't get seasick. And so we really lucked out. Eba was actually my companion animal. And in 2019, we found ourselves in need of a scat dog really quickly. And I just on a whim, we went ahead and tested Eba, and it turned out she was just a phenomenal scat dog. So we really lucked out there. So in an idealized situation, we're going to be downwind to the side and behind the whales by several hundred meters or even more. And ideally, a whale will poop, and the wind will come across that scat sample, and we're downwind and at a 90-degree angle, transiting parallel to the path of the whales. And then EBA will have a change of behavior way out here in this scent cone where it's showing as green. And she'll get up on the front of the boat with her paws on the front of the boat, and we know that she's on a scent. This photo is a great picture. This is showing that she's on a scent. She's still working her way into the strongest part of the scent cone. And when we hit the strongest part of the scent cone, she'll drop down or crab walk along the side of the boat. And that's when we know to turn the boat into the wind. And then it ends up being just this kind of jockeying zigzag motion because remember, we're in the marine realm. So the scat is moving with the tide and current. And so we have to continue to keep EBAs actively engaged until she brings us right up alongside the scat. And in a perfect world, we're going to be looking for and finding scat that's this big. It's rare these days to find scat this big. We get it. We do get them this big when the whales are first coming into the inland waters, like they've been foraging out on the outer coast, or if there's a strong salmon run in the Salish Sea, in their home waters here, and they're foraging for several days, we end up getting these beautiful scat samples that will yield just so much knowledge from one scat sample. Unfortunately, when the whales are not getting enough to eat, they end up having what we consider diarrhea, very watery, diffuse scat. Sometimes it's tiny, like the size of your thumb or pinky nail. EBA can take us to that, and we can still collect that and analyze it for some of the information that we're seeking. But when we're looking to analyze these scat samples for toxicants, for persistent organic pollutants, we need relatively large samples. I'm happy to say that some of the lab techniques are changing over time, and they're getting better and better, meaning that we can analyze smaller scat samples and still yield a tremendous amount of information. So I'll try and play this video, and hopefully it'll show what EBA is working for. This is her playing.
Get it, EBA, get it. Good job. Good girl.
So we learned, by the way, that was in 2019. We learned that year that she doesn't even need that Kong. All she needs is a piece of rope. So that's really good that we always have line on the boat. So anyway, these are some of the things that we're looking for in scat samples. So we can tell what species it is. We already know what species because we're tracking behind either killer whales or humpback whales or gray whales or something. But we can also tell who the individual was. We can extract the DNA from the scat sample. We can tell if it's a female, and if it's a female, if she's pregnant. If she's pregnant, we can tell how pregnant because different hormones change during different stages of pregnancy. We also can look for stress hormones, nutrition hormones, again, toxicant levels of all kinds. We can look for things like PCBs, DDT. Those are PCBs were industrial lubricants that were banned 50 years ago, but still prevalent in the wild, unfortunately. Hence the name persistent organic pollutants. DDT was a chemical used in agriculture, also banned in the United States in the early 70s, 50 years ago, but still manufactured here and shipped overseas, unfortunately. So we're contributing to the toxification of other lands and other animals, unfortunately. Also things like PBDEs, these are flame retardants. We're now going to be looking at, with the help of some Navy research colleagues, we're going to be looking at 6-PPD, the chemicals coming off tires. Really, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. It's really, really fascinating, the things that you can find in one scat sample. Things like parasites. We're looking for prey DNA now, so we can analyze a fecal sample and say, not only that, kind of the suite of different animals that they've eaten, whether it's a rockfish, which they do eat sometimes, or maybe a skate, or different salmon species. We can break that down as well, which is very exciting, where this is brand new for us. And then these other things, in addition to other that was weird. The 69% of the animals, 69% of the females in this population are who are getting pregnant are losing their animals, or their calves, either in utero, so they're spontaneously miscarrying, or they are giving birth to the baby and the baby dies right away, like happened with J60 in December of last year. We also see when the whales are not getting enough to eat, we do see this amplification of toxicants coming out in their feces. As I mentioned, they're metabolizing their fat stores and releasing those chemicals into their system.
Hey, Jill, I just want to let you know we're not seeing your screen right now. You might need to share it again.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That's okay. Just listening is fascinating. So
I'd rather you see the screen for sure.
there we go. That's back.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I'm almost done with the presentation. Oh my goodness me. Okay. And so all of these things are leading, as I mentioned, to disease and early death. Really quickly, I just wanted to mention that we are looking at other things. This is a very interesting behavior that the fish-eating southern resident killer whales engage in. I termed it phocinocide, so the killing of porpoise, harbor porpoise, and Dall's porpoise. They basically just play with them to death. They do not eat them. We have over 70 accounts of the southern residents engaging in this behavior, and not one time have they taken a bite out of these animals. Unfortunately, part of me really wishes that they would, but eating fish is very culturally driven in this population. So I would be surprised to see them shifting prey to starting to forage on marine mammals. So while we at Wild Orca, our research is steeped in the discipline of conservation biology, and one of the tenets of conservation biology is that species have intrinsic value separate from what humans can gain from them. And a big part of that is the recognition that they have a right to survive in their natural environment. Especially, it's our responsibility to try and recover species when they're declining because of our actions. And so everything that we do is in an attempt to recover this species and ultimately get them removed from the endangered species list. I encourage you to look at our action page. You can get involved with things that you personally can do. Throughout our website, we've got our translational science up there with our deeper dives and frontline pieces explaining what's happening with the population. And then our action guide tells people what they can do to help. I'm just going to get through this a little bit. Want to give a shout out to the amazing team at Wild Orca, including our board of directors, and of course, Eba the whale dog. You can follow her on Instagram. I will admit that I'm terrible at updating her account, but she does have one with some cute pictures. And the rest of our team, many people that are just volunteers, including the folks that come out with us, islanders that spend their time coming out with us, helping to find scat and collect the other data that we collect. And obviously we couldn't do this without our funders. There's my my calling card. If you want to jot down that information, if you want to follow up with me after the fact. And I think I'll just stop sharing and go to questions if anybody has any.
There are some, yes. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I mean, I've been a toxicologist in the Northwest for a long time, and I've done a lot of work on salmon toxicology and implications for whales. And I learned a lot of new stuff that I did not know during your talk today. So thank you very much. That was
Oh, sure. Thank you for that feedback too.
no, it was great. I think the intensity of the culture of the whales is something that is not communicated very well to the public somehow, because I have not heard it. Maybe other people have, but that's something that was just absolutely astounding to me to see that when the pods come together and have all these social.
Oh my gosh, yes. And that's just, I just put up two there because we were time limited, but these whales are, I think one of the things that people might not know is that they are so unique between them. Their personalities are so evident that, and those of us that are, I feel it's an honor to get to research them. We see that, and I'm not as much of an expert on other animal populations. I know that some animals certainly have personalities and characteristics that are unique to them as individuals. But boy, I just can't stress that enough, that these whales, you've got loners, you've got animals that are really, really like it's almost like they come out of their mom breaching. Some of them love to roll around in kelp. Some of them are really social, and some of the young females are really, like baby crazy. They just love hanging out with the calves. Some of the young males are known babysitters, and I just love that about them as individuals and as members of this population. And it certainly makes my job easier, as far as like, hopefully I'm conveying some of that uniqueness and getting people jazzed about wanting to become involved in their recovery.
Great. Yeah, that's super. There's questions about the issue of residents being fish-eating whales and transients being marine mammal-eating whales. And you've talked about it a fair amount and saying it's their culture. It doesn't look like they're going to change if they're going to kill harbor porpoise and then not eat them when they've got something that's, obviously a lot of calories right there. So people just wanted to hear a little more about how that could have come about, how these, because they're basically the same species, although different genetics, and they're separate. But why? And one person asked whether or not it might be, they thought they'd heard it was tooth structure that might make it such that fish eaters have difficulty preying on marine mammals. So if you could expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic, especially right now, because if we were having this lecture last month even, it would be a different conversation. But the fact of the matter is that there's a brand new paper, and it's coming out, and it's going to be it was co-written by a number of different authors. It's led by our colleagues at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and it's essentially a proposal to come up with two new species. So right now, all killer whales on the planet are considered one species, Orcinus orca. This paper is suggesting that the killer whales that occur in the Pacific Ocean are distinct enough. They have 5 criteria. I won't go through all of the criteria that they're looking for, but suffice it to say, the whales in the Pacific Ocean meet the 5 criteria to come up with 2 new species, and that would be all fish-eating killer whales from so including the southern residents, which are the fish-eating killer whales that occur at the southern extent. And then would it be the northern resident fish-eating killer whales at the kind of top of Vancouver Island, Southeast Alaskan fish-eating killer whales, all the way over to Japan, and the fish-eating killer whales that occur in Japan would be considered one new species. And then all of the mammal-eating killer whales that occur in those same waters, so in the North Pacific waters, the mammal-eating killer whales would be considered one species as well. Now I'm actually questioning whether or not the California mammal-eating killer whales would be included in that new species. But if not, it's certainly the ones that we currently call Biggs killer whales, which are the ones, there are several hundred of them, and they're the ones that occur regularly in the inland waters of the Salish Sea. They do go down on the outer coast. They do go up to Southeast Alaska. So the rationale as far as the morphology is concerned is to the point of the question asker, there is differences. There are differences, morphological differences, where if you found a skeleton of a mammal-eating killer whale versus a fish-eating killer whale, a morphologist would be able to determine that there was a difference. And part of that is tooth structure. It's not really structure, it's more like size. Jaw, the robustness of the jaw of the mammal-eating killer whales is more so. Physically, the mammal-eating killer whales are slightly bigger. Pigmentation of the mammal-eating killer whales is different. You just don't see open saddle patches, for example, on mammal-eating killer whales. Their dorsal fins are bigger. Interestingly, it's thought that the kind of the prototypic, the original killer whale was a fish eater, and that over time, most likely during the glacial, interglacial periods, there was a separation, physical separation of these populations. And some of them were able to, kind of become specialists on salmon, and other populations became specialists on mammals. Over that time period, culturally, they became so distinct that they just don't see each other as mates. Now, why might this happen? Evolutionarily, it makes sense, because the only thing that can kill a killer whale is another killer whale or a human. And so in order to lessen the potential for conflict between these, what we currently call different ecotypes, in order to lessen the competition, they eat at different levels of the food chain. They physically are separated from each other to some degree. Interesting, the mammal eaters, if they are, say, in the inland waters around the San Juan Islands, for example, and the fish eaters come back home, the mammal eaters leave, even though they're physically bigger. But anyway, so they habitat partition, and then they partition on the food web so that they're not in conflict with one another. They're just lessening the potential for conflict. That's not to say that there haven't been some occasions where there has been physical contact between the mammal eaters and the fish eaters, but in all accounts, the fish eaters are the ones that are the aggressors and chase the mammal eaters out of the area.
Wow, fascinating. Again, people put it in the chat. I'm learning stuff I had no idea about. So that's great. You should be talking to everybody all the time. So other questions. I was not aware, and others asked that you were determining prey species from scat. I guess that makes sense because there would be DNA in there. I'm curious how what you're finding, and it sounds like you're only doing that fairly recently. How is that comparing to what people have found from analyses of scales after predation events? It seems like that would be so much richer data for understanding the prey species of the killer whales.
It will end up being a richer data set because we have so many more samples of scat than we do fish scales or fish tissue after predation events. So I do want to go on record as saying my colleague Brad Hansen and his team at NOAA have been engaged in this in analysis of scat samples and prey DNA through tissue and scales for a number of years. And we've actually contributed our scat samples to their studies in the past. And we will continue doing that going forward. We're getting involved in this work right now so that we can help basically catch them up. We have the technology is changing and getting so much better so that we're it's number one, you can do it with smaller scat samples, as well as it's cheaper now. And so we're going to kind of come in as the kind of rear flank, I guess you could say, helping Brad's team update the data set, because we have hundreds of samples that have not been analyzed. And Brad's team at NOAA there's one person doing that analysis. And so we're physically, we haven't actually started doing this. We're going to be starting in June. We're being trained by Brad's former postdoc to do this work. My lab down at San Diego will be trained in June to do this work, and then we'll go back and analyze our legacy samples. But to answer the first part of your question, we can answer essentially the same kind of information as far as not only prey DNA, but shockingly, we can say where, say, for example, a Chinook salmon came from. Was it a Fraser River Chinook salmon? And not only that, ultimately we'll be able to say it's a tributary of the Fraser River, that, North Fork of the Thompson River. That scat sample was from a fish that came from that river. And so when you think about it in terms of like management implications, we'll be able to say, and I didn't mention that the prey DNA from scat samples is something that's getting to the point where we could do this on every scat sample in the field, which is shocking.
This environmental DNA field is just, we're learning so much, and it's so.
Yeah.
Is
So
it
we can,
other questions, but one question germane right now, how much is it basically funding? That's the resource limitations for getting these all done quicker? Okay, yeah. Because I know Brad real well. Yeah, they need more people.
Brad is phenomenal. And it was funding, but it was also personnel. And his team has just been able to hire a new geneticist, which is very exciting. So she'll be able to go and I think she's maybe starting this month even. She'll be able to go back and bring his catalog up to date, not only on the scat samples that his team has collected, but also the prey DNA from the tissue and scales. And then we will continue going forward providing scat samples after everybody's all caught up.
Okay, great. One question, when you talk about the ability to really key in on the different species or the origin of the different species, that sort of leads into the question of what we're talking about now. Should we be really pumping out a lot more hatchery Chinook to try to, bolster the fish in the ocean? And there's many opinions on whether that's good or bad. I still don't quite understand why we have chum hatcheries. I know there's good reasons, but we should be producing Chinook, it seems, rather than chum. What are your thoughts on sort of the number one, would you be able to tell hatchery versus wild origin Chinook eventually? And if you could, that would probably be really helpful to answer this question about, should we be trying to fill the ocean with Chinook salmon in all throughout the ranges of the southern and northern or southern residents?
So my answer to the hatchery question is the situation is complicated. My answer to that is that not all hatcheries are created equally. And what I mean by that is that there are some hatcheries that are done in order to not impact the timing and essentially overly produce hatchery fish that will come in conflict with wild salmon that we're also trying to recover. It's vitally important that people recognize that there are multiple stocks of Chinook salmon, wild stocks of Chinook salmon throughout the Pacific Ocean that are also on the endangered species list. And we have a responsibility to recover those stocks for themselves, but also for this species within the ecosystems that have co-evolved and rely on them. There was a study that came out, a multi-partner study that showed that something like 137 or 139 other species rely on Chinook salmon for part of their lives. And so recovering wild stocks is vitally important. So to have hatchery fish not come into competition, overly come into competition. Every new mouth that you put in the water is competition for wild stocks. But these things can be timed in a way that limit that competition. And we really need to be thinking about that. Right now, I am afraid that there is a general push by the state and fed agencies to like hyper produce fish. Last year, we put in 50 million Chinook salmon into the system, ostensibly for southern resident killer whales. The problem is that there's nothing that guarantees that the whales are going to get any of those extra fish. So what Wild Orca focuses on is trying to push for kind of looking at the fisheries issues. Fisheries management, when we're allowing so much fish that are native to not only Washington, but say Idaho, that come through the Columbia Basin So Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and then BC, Canada, fish that are native to this region of the planet that go to Alaska and get caught in Alaskan fisheries and branded as Alaskan fish. That's I think the bigger problem right now. We need to get a better hold on what the bycatch or the targeted catch of salmon that are born down here, both fit hatchery and wild, that are being caught in Alaska and branded as Alaskan fish. Now, I know that pits me, or it seemingly pits me or whales against the Alaskan fishermen, but the fact is that fishing in Alaska is crashing, and this is all connected. And we need to be thinking about this holistically. What I say is that we need to be thinking about fisheries management from the salmon's perspective. Right now, we're managing fisheries from the human perspective in these artificially created councils that don't take into consideration where the fish are coming from as much as they should be. They do to some degree, but not to the degree that they need to. And so there's a lot of different issues there. But when we're, again, there's all this money coming in to increase hatchery production, theoretically to feed southern resident killer whales, but no management actions that are in place that will guarantee that the whales have some of that fish. There's no allocation of fish for the whales. They just they're fished, and then whatever comes back, the fish get carved up by human fishermen. And so that's, I'm sorry if that didn't really answer the question directly,
No,
but it's a complicated situation.
I agree. I knew when I asked it, it was going to be it's a complex answer. Staying on the subject of salmon, because that's obviously, I think you laid it out really well, that it's the lack of salmon that is leading to all these other issues, both social issues, toxicological issues. It was very persuasive. A number of people have asked, how much would it help to breach the Snake River dams?
Well, you won't find a killer whale biologist that thinks that taking the dams down isn't incredibly important. It's right up there on the very most important things that we need to be doing. The history of that river, the Columbia Basin as a whole used to put out, it was the biggest producer of Chinook salmon in the world. And out of that, half of that is thought to have come from the Snake River. And when we put those dams in, we declined that production to about 10% of historic runs. Now we're down to somewhere around 1% of the historic runs that go. Quite honestly, I'm shocked that there's any wild stocks making it back to their natal spawning ground above those 4 dams. There are so many reasons to breach those dams. Climate change related. They're heavy producers of methane and other greenhouse gases that are created behind those dams, exacerbating the situation with climate change. But from the salmon's perspective, one of the main reasons to breach those dams is because the waters above those 4 dams provides hundreds of miles of what can be still considered pristine spawning habitat. By far, it is the highest elevation, coldest water habitat that's left available to salmon. And so, and as climate the climate continues to change, rivers continue to heat up, that is going to be a refugia for wild stocks that is unparalleled with any other river system. So going forward, it's vital to take those dams down, and it's a timing thing. If nobody, or some people hopefully have, and others will going forward, there's a movie called The Lost Salmon. And I do believe that it's available on the internet. It was put out by Swiftwater Films. Shane Anderson is the executive producer and videographer. It's a phenomenal film talking about the spring gene. And actually, people from UC Davis, my school alma mater, folks were able to isolate the spring gene. And that's a gene that allows fish to get big. Those fish that I showed in my slide, those over 100-pound Chinook salmon, absolutely those fish were from the Snake River. And so if we're going to have any hope at all of recovering salmon to any size at all, it's going to mean breaching those dams and getting those fish back up into their natal spawning grounds. This is just an example. Again, these whales need several hundreds of pounds of food per day per whale to survive. 2 or 3 of those salmon back at the turn of the last century would have fed them. Number one, the fish that big are slower and easier to catch. Number two, more importantly, they're hugely lipid rich. And so that's what the whales need to survive. The average size Chinook salmon in Washington state now is less than 12 pounds. So for a whale that needs to eat several hundreds of pounds of food per day, they're having to forage for 20 times or 25 times for these less caloric rich salmon. And so they're expending more energy. It's harder to catch them because the fish are more nimble, they're faster, and the whales are having to work so much harder to just meet their basic metabolic needs. And again, when that happens, the whales are releasing those toxicants into their system, which is causing problems with the pregnancy issues. Also, we're losing males just as they're reaching breeding age, because of course, females that are gestating calves are offloading a percentage of their toxicants into their gestating fetus. And then if they do have a calf that is born and starts nursing, they're offloading almost 100% of their toxicants into their calf. It's why we have such high calf, part of the reason why we have such high calf mortality. But another one of the big problems is that we're now losing males just as they're entering that breeding age. And we know from looking at these whales that the females are preferentially choosing the oldest, biggest males. And so we're having limited numbers of males for these females to choose from. But more importantly, the males are not able to offload their toxicants, and they're dying right before they're entering breeding age. One of the other things that we're now looking at is testosterone levels in males, and trying to see, because of course these toxicants are also estrogen mimickers in a lot of cases. And so one of the things we want to look at is whether or not we're seeing low testosterone levels, which might also be causing a problem with the ability for these females to get pregnant. That being said, it doesn't seem like the females are having a problem getting pregnant. They're just having a problem staying pregnant.
Okay, well, wow, fascinating. We're just about out of time. There's a lot of questions I just haven't got to. I've been trying to scroll back and forth, but I missed a bunch. People will get contact information, and people will probably follow up with some questions for you. I think one quick question that came to mind, this is just from me. Up in Alaska, resident killer whales are notorious for taking halibut and sablefish off of long lines. Has anybody proposed doing long line fishing and then letting them just come up slowly so the residents can eat them off the lines? I'm just curious if
I haven't heard of any targeted activities like that. We do know that the southern residents do eat sablefish when they're on the outer coast, and these are actually, because sablefish are deep fish, as I understand it. So it's possible that sort of thing is happening on the outer coast, but I have not heard any fishermen talking about southern residents predating on their lines. It would not be a thing that would be good for the whales to teach them.
Yeah, people don't like that. Okay, well, we're out of time, Giles. Thank you so much. We could talk for another hour or two at least. We'll stay in touch.
Great. Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.